This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
She unwittingly found herself in the middle of a high-profile murder case. The author of Diamond in the Dark, Phyllis Hain, on this edition of Conversations. In her book, Diamond in the Dark, Phyllis Hain details what should have been the beginning of a new life, but quickly turned into what could be a made-for-TV movie with enough twists, turns, and mysteries to challenge even the most imaginative. In the early 1980s, Phyllis married Paul Leverett, a well-known Mobile, Alabama businessman. The honeymoon was short-lived and replaced with arrest, trials, and eventually prison, all played out on the front page of the newspaper. But as she writes in the book, it was only a piece of a complicated life plagued by abuse and violence, a trend that began in childhood. Phyllis ultimately broke that cycle and drew on her lifetime of hardships to teach and influence other victims of abuse how to reclaim their lives. Although now retired, she spent nearly a decade working as a U.S. Navy sexual assault response coordinator and a family advocacy educator. We welcome Phyllis Hain to this edition of Conversations. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
The book is Diamond in the Dark. What's it about?
Well, what I love about your intro is it really does just gets right to the heart of the matter. And what my book is about is I started reliving and thinking about, that time in my life about 30 years ago when I was married to Paul Leverett. And my children, they're the ones who encouraged me to write this book because they wanted people to hear my story. And so the book is about me. It's my autobiography, and it's a different type of autobiography in that it's not just a memoir about that time. What I did is I wrote, it basically covers my entire life. And what I fell into with that story, with trying to capture that piece of my life, is it didn't make sense to just hone in that segment. In order for people to really understand what happened, I felt like they had to get to know me first. Mm-hmm. And I had one person who gave me the most marvelous quote during the course of that time, and he asked me a question. He said, "How did a nice girl like you get in a mess like this?" And so that's what the book is about. It's how a nice girl like me got into a mess like that.
Well, how did a nice girl like you get into a mess like that?
How did I get into a mess? I actually was in a very abusive marriage filled with domestic violence, and I had married very young. And it took me a long time to get out of that relationship. And in fact, it had put my family, my dear friends, my children, all of them became in danger while they were trying to help me escape from that relationship. And during the course of that time, I was out working and I met someone who was very, very kind to me, an older man that offered me some help and some resources to get out of that relationship. And that actually, I feel like without that help, I probably could have never gotten out, and I feel like he saved my life. So I had a lot of loyalty toward him. And I married Paul Leverett in 1980, in November, and we had a wonderful marriage. He was very kind to me, loving, and to my children. And about a little more than 2 years after we had been married, he was arrested for capital murder for hire for his first wife. And it was a tragic thing for me. I didn't believe it, and I was very loyal to him because I did not believe him capable of doing such a thing. And but it did put my family and friends again into just chaos for years of trying to struggle through that trial and rebuilding my life after that.
I can imagine, as I mentioned in the intro, you were sort of unwittingly brought into this. And in the book, you talk about at one point that you were even hauled before a grand jury, eventually arrested and charged with perjury. You want to
They did. I think they were looking for anything to get a break in the case because it was an unsolved case, and originally I had thought that it had been a murder that took place during the course of a robbery, and it actually was one of the things that was missing when Mrs. Leverett, the first Mrs. Leverett, was murdered, was a very large diamond. And that diamond is part of the story, where it was and how it ended up. I won't tell you all of it, but it was interesting in how that almost 4-carat diamond played a huge part. So I think that you can look at this, some people might say that I was the diamond in the dark, but there was another diamond that was in the dark in this book as well. Oh, wow. And Stacy Kosovicki, who is a very dear friend from Gulf Coast Kids House, director there, her quote was, "It's a wonderful autobiography that reads like a murder mystery."
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to do is to be able to tell my story, because once I was caught up in that, I was not able to speak out. And the press was terrible. We were the Mobile, Alabama soap opera for years. And that was devastating for not only me, but for my children and my family and my parents. So it was hard.
And I think one thing worth noting, if you go back to that time frame, just to the magnitude of the press in those days, it was prior to all the cable channels. So you would have had 3 or 4 network television stations and newspapers. So I could imagine you were really right in the midst of.
We were on the news almost every night, and every time for years, if any little break came up, they reran the entire story again. Wow. And it was, my brother lived in Washington State at the time, and he was following the case in Washington State. So it was a national story. And I didn't look very well during the course of that, but I couldn't do anything. There was no way to really come out in my own defense. And I enjoyed going before the grand jury because that was when I did have a chance to talk and tell people what had happened. But it was not that particular grand jury. I think it was 2 grand juries later that some additional information came in, and they put that before the grand jury and contrasted it with something that I had said when I had given testimony and I was arrested. But that was that too, and I don't want to give away what happened, but that was a terrible, and I was very fearful of what could have happened because I was in a lot of trouble, and I hadn't done anything. I really had not done anything, but I could have gone to prison.
Wow.
So.
Wow. And with Paul, he was eventually convicted and sent to prison.
He was convicted, but it was a jury that had a very difficult time finding he was charged with murder for hire. The conviction, actually, though, was simply murder. And there was never any evidence put forward that he had murdered her. It was everything that the prosecution's case put forward was that he had paid to have her murdered. But they chose the lesser offense of murder, and he was convicted, and he did go to prison for that.
Mm-hmm. And then you guys were still married for quite some time while he was in prison, right?
Yes. In fact, I stayed married to him longer while he was in prison than we had been able to live together. We lived together as man and wife about a little over 2 years, and we were married, I believe, right over 5 years before I finally asked him for a divorce. And we had a divorce. We agreed that it was the best thing to do.
Yeah, because I guess you just weren't getting anywhere with appeals as far as making.
Well, I stayed until it went through to the Supreme Court for the appeals case. I stayed for that.
And do you want to talk about what ultimately happened to him in prison?
No.
No?
No, I want them to read the book for that.
You want to save that
It's
for the
a
book?
fascinating, it's a
It is.
fascinating story, and I'm very proud of the fact that what he did once he went to prison was he found, as he always would, a niche, and he helped hundreds of inmates, young inmates, receive their GEDs. He became a teacher while he was in prison, and he stayed long enough until he actually he went to a minimum security farm. And everywhere he went, he was such a dynamic personality, and he had so many skills, and everyone really liked him. And he basically lived at a cattle ranch, which was a prison cattle ranch, and he had his own little place on the ranch, there by the warden's office. So, you know, everywhere he went, he was well liked.
Yeah. It's a very fascinating and interesting story with, as I said, a lot of twists and turns.
It was a long journey, and I took, unfortunately, a lot of wrong roads along the way, and had to regroup and go back. And the only thing I can say is that I did the best I could with what was going on at the time. And there are different reasons to write a book, and I think some people want to settle a score, and mine is not to settle a score, but I think that what I wanted to do is just have a chance to defend myself and say, this really is what was going on in my life, and I want people to know, I want them to know what was happening that made me make those decisions that appeared to be so bad from the outside, but if you were from my side looking in, you can understand how I got into that mess.
Well, you're extremely open and extremely honest in this book. That must have been difficult.
It was. It was extremely difficult, but like I say, when you get into that center of the book, I wanted so badly to be able to convey and tell my story that I said, what I have to do is go back to the beginning and let people know how I grew up. And my father, who was a wonderful man, but he suffered terribly. He was a wounded warrior coming back from World War II. He had acute brain trauma, which for me, I'm going to say that he had PTSD. He suffered terribly from that, even though PTSD was not a diagnosis at that time. But he had the binges of drinking and also binges of violence, and violent toward mother and eventually toward me. And so that affected my life. I ended up, when children grow up in abusive homes or where they witness violence, and they make bad decisions because their world, they live in a world where violence and abuse is normal. And not only that, they live in a world where you learn not to talk about it, so you remain silent. And you learn to just go on day by day, and people don't know what's going on in your home. And that's the one thing that I wanted to come through. If nothing else, in my book, it's an interesting read, I think, but to let people know that when people are silent about abuse because they're ashamed to let people know what's happening in their lives, then that empowers abusers to continue to abuse. You know, as long as people remain silent, whether it's domestic abuse, child abuse, sexual assault, if they keep that within themselves and they stay ashamed, it affects them. It affects, of course, their self-esteem. It affects how they interact with other people, their value within the community. They may feel less than some of the other people who they may appear to have normal lives. And so they make, you know, a lot of wrong decisions. Part of that is, you know, getting married early, way too early, out of wedlock children. Very difficult time, and it rolls from one abusive situation into, as I did, into another abusive situation. Because abuse was a world I was very comfortable with.
So you just sort of become immune to it, I suppose.
You do. It's normal. You normalize the abuse. Doesn't everyone have fights like this in their home? You know, where knives are brandished about, or guns or whatever. Guns were very commonplace in our home. I mean, it was nothing if someone got angry that they would get a gun.
Wow.
To settle. But my father was just very, very sick. And what contrasted with that was also he was a very loving and religious person. So if that doesn't create a conflict, nothing will. So it was we would be in church 3 times a week, and law enforcement would be in our house, once a month.
Wow.
So it was a huge gap in, from learning to be good and being held accountable on the religious and spiritual side of our lives, and also learning to deal with the abuse and the conflict and how that affected our home lives as well.
I want to point out that you went on to work quite extensively in advocacy programs along the way, so you do speak here with some authority and some credibility on what you're talking about. How, in your judgment, does a person, a woman, I'm assuming children, maybe men, I don't know, how do they recognize that they are in this destructive situation and then get out of it?
Well, I think that many people who are in destructive situations, they already know. But every family dynamic is different. Subtle nuances of how things work within a household. As they say, you really never know what goes on behind the doors in somebody's home. But oftentimes family and friends have glimpses into what's going on with the couples. And you can be concerned if you see some of the things that you can look for is, does the person have bruises that they cover? Is the person allowed to socialize? Are they limited as to who they can see, who they can talk to? Is a spouse extremely jealous and possessive? Are they not free to be able to, have normal relationships and maybe even attend church? And you can see where people are having problems. One of the biggest ways to abuse people, too, that most people don't think about is economic abuse and financial abuse, because if women do not have access to any money or funds, or they're so limited as to what they can purchase, it's hard to have a normal life when you really can't access anything financially. So those are abuse signs that you can look for. And just talking with someone, I think my key would be to observe, and if people, to listen to what people say. I think listening to them and believe them if they say, I don't feel safe. I can't leave because so-and-so would beat me up, or they would hurt me, or they would hurt my animals, animal abuse. They would hurt my children. If someone is fearful of leaving, there's a reason for that. And that is the highest time when we see homicides occur, is when families start to break up. When that victim of abuse finally decides to leave, that's when the risk goes up considerably for their safety.
What should they do once they decide to leave? How should they go about it to be safe for themselves and their children?
Well, I think that there are ways to establish emergency plans, and that is to make sure, maybe have a little money set aside, have a friend or someone who can help you. Make a plan ahead of time. How will you be able to leave? We have wonderful shelters here in Pensacola and in most cities. And that is one thing, a hotline number as far as 1-800-799-SAFE, SAFE. That's a number that can be called, and people can give you places where you can seek shelter.
Are men abused by women? I mean, and I understand that, I know that's probably typically not the case, but I have read things that evidently that happens. Does it?
Absolutely. Women can abuse. Women can be extremely jealous, domineering. Women become stalkers. Women, they can make lives miserable when they don't have their way, and that's a form of manipulation, control. But men have a harder time saying, my wife is abusing me, and somehow maybe test their manhood, so to speak. They don't want to say, that someone is beating them up.
Right.
But I have actually seen where men have been beaten up by their wives because they didn't fight back.
Right.
And it's, a number. I witnessed a female that waited for somebody outside the building with a baseball bat. So yes, men can be abused, absolutely.
Child abuse, is it a bigger problem than we think?
Oh, I think child abuse is people have no idea how many children are being abused. And I think that recognizing that not just abuse, but neglect is a huge factor. Because what I see as far as abuse is concerned, many times abuse is intentional. If somebody is spanking a child too hard, or, if they're sending them to bed without any supper, things like that, where children are being abused. But we also have many families where children are being neglected because the parents are either, maybe they're ill, maybe they're on drugs, maybe they're not able to parent appropriately because they're so stressed out over relationship or abusive relationships between the spouses that they neglect their children. And you can understand that a mother who has been going through violence for the night and having to get up the next day with bruises to take care of children, that mother may be too stressed to be a good mother and to take care of the child's needs the way they should.
And child sex abuse obviously is a problem. How do you make your children aware that that exists, and how do you let them know the things that they should look for, while at the same time not making them live in a constant state of fear?
Well, one of the biggest things is to understand that the vast majority of children that are sexually abused are abused by someone the family knows. It will be either a family member or friend of the family. And people who are friends of the family, oftentimes they know how to work parents so they gain their trust, so then they have more access to children. But I think with children, it's mainly to teach them that, that they do have private areas. They do have the right to say no. If somebody wants to kiss them, they have the right to say, no, I don't want to kiss, Uncle whoever.
Right.
And, let children have a bit of control over, their space, and appreciate the fact that if they don't like someone, there may be a reason why they don't like to be hugged or held by someone. So you can look for little things within a child's life, and if they tell you, or if they're afraid to be with a person, or they're secretive, or being told to keep secrets, teach your children about good secrets and bad secrets. Bad secrets are ones that hurt you. Mm-hmm. Or if somebody ever says, if you tell, I will hurt you, then those are signs, always keeping that communication open. And I have to tell you, I'm not a counselor. I'm a layman in this field that has had the opportunity to work with a lot of victims. So I don't want to come on this show to like I'm a PhD in the subject.
Right.
I am of hard knocks, but not of, as far as academically knowing. There are so many psychologists that are available to help people, social workers that can help deal with this, but teaching your children that their bodies are private. And one of the things that we did teach them within the small ones in our centers was, if it's covered up by a swimsuit, then that's the private areas that you don't let anybody touch. Right. So that's just the way to take care of it, is to teach them that they have a right to say yes or no, and it's their body, and keep that communication open.
Speaking of counselors, I know in the book, in the end, is it Dr. Brian?
Dr. Brian Glazier.
It sort of wrapped up kind of your whole story. Give me just about 60 seconds a synopsis of what he was talking about.
Well, it was my idea with Brian, Dr. Glazier, was to allow him to read my story first. And I wanted to get a feel for how he would perceive the things that I had done, basically how I was doing psychologically, where I had moved along my life's journey to be more healthy and to be able to help others. And I found his insight to be entertaining, and I could see some things that he brought out and how I progressed, but I think the biggest eye-opener for me was when I read my entire book, this body of work from beginning to end, and then I started seeing patterns of behavior that became very apparent to me after it was over with, that I hadn't recognized within myself. And I don't really know how the path took me from where I started to where I became an advocate, but working with victims, I feel like it was where I was intended to be. And I just ended up there, and I have to say it must have been the grace of God that took me along that path, because that's where I ended up, was to be able to help others. And the more I helped others, the more I realized that I had been in the same places that they were. And it gave me, I think, more love and more empathy for working with them.
Thank you so very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. Best of luck with the book. It's called Diamond in the Dark. Phyllis Hain is the author, and of course she has a website as well. You can find diamondinthedark.com and some interesting observations on that website. Fascinating book. I guess I described it as wow when I finished reading it. What a story, no question about it. By the way, you can see more of our conversations online at wsre.org/conversations. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for spending some time with us. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take great care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Support for this program is provided in part by these corporate sponsors. And by viewers like you.